Things could be different, but I don't know how. I'm going through changes, through all of the strangeness. I'm going through changes now.
So thank you all for taking a moment to kind of answer this question that has been the kind of crux of what this project is all about. And so before we get into talking about this project, I'll just give a brief SWISLR RCN update. I don't have a lot of announcements. I just want to say thank you all for joining us today for our webinar. And then also a reminder that please save the date for the SALT conference, which stands for Salinity Affected Lands in Transition, and our kind of 1.5 working day and field trips directly after this SALT conference. And so this event will be June 11th through 14th. And the most recent news about this is we will have our graphic facilitator again at our working day meeting to help us conceptualize and synthesize everything that we've accomplished so far and kind of still need to do with the RCN. So now onto the project that spawned from the last SWISLR meeting. And sorry if I pause weirdly, I'm multitasking of having people, letting them enter into the meeting while I'm talking. But today we will be joined by Torry Bend, and I will start off the presentation and then she'll take it on the second half. And we're going to talk through what we've done since the conceptualization of the Stories of Change project. Torry Bend is a professor here at Duke. She is in the practice of theater studies, and she is a puppet artist and a scenic designer who has worked on puppetry and set design on many different projects. And recently, she is bringing in climate change and SWISLR into her puppetry and set designs. So after I give an overview of where we've been, she will kind of bring you on a journey into the future. So we will be coming back to this question again. So if you didn't get a chance to enter your response, you'll have more chances later. This is the outline of the day. I guess I should have put this up while we were talking, but first I'll talk about the SWISLR research so far, and then we'll talk about where we can kind of go into the future with community engagement. And then we'll all come together with a discussion on how you all talk about SWISLR and where you talk about SWISLR. And onto the Stories of Change itself, I'm really excited to kind of present this project and how it's evolved and changed throughout the year, and have a chance to kind of talk about where we're taking it and where you all think that we might be able to even take it further. So our original plan was kind of a complex idea that we started talking about what could we possibly do with the common thread of trying to engage with community members in a meaningful way. And so our original goals were to talk about what do people want to talk about, finding out what people are concerned about, what they're already talking about, what they're not talking about. And we wanted to understand what people are facing when it comes to SWISLR itself. We then wanted to see who was already completing this work, and so that's kind of where the literature review comes in that I'll be talking about, and who's in power when we're talking about SWISLR impacts and SWISLR reactions. And that who's in power is kind of a tricky question that I'm not going to be able to touch on here, because this project has really shifted into the first kind of two questions of what are people seeing and responding to, and then what has already been done. So we tried combining all of these ideas to get a really full picture of change along the coast. And I wanted to share that we had a lot of really insightful conversations at the SWISLR All Hands meeting and talked about the existing projects that have already been done in this sphere. But as we talked, we kind of came to this common ground of climate change is scary. It's scary to coastal community members. It causes change in their surroundings. It causes loss and grief. And we wanted to pitch a project that would kind of meet people where they are in these kind of scary times. But we also came to the common idea that people are also inundated with a lot of information and jargon. And so we also wanted to try and create a space where they didn't necessarily need to feel bombarded with information and they could just talk freely about the changes that they are seeing. So we came to the conclusion that stories are a powerful way to complete this and get this done. A couple of examples that we came up with were that sad stories allow for somewhere for you to hold your grief. When you're telling a sad story, it can help you kind of come to terms with that grief. Educational stories are a kind of easy way to enter into a new idea or new information. And then creative stories, so a little bit of that question that we asked at the beginning, allow a place for you to imagine an ideal scenario or imagine a future. But with all of this said, of wanting to get into storytelling, we wanted to make sure that we had a strong foundation so that we could gather these stories in an ethical way and in a way that would be on the that would allow the community members to have ownership of these stories as well. So what this turned into are kind of two branches of this Stories of Change project. The first one is the literature review that I'll be talking about, and the second one is the Envisioning Coastal Futures that Torry will be talking about more. And for the literature review, we really wanted to answer this general question of what's already out there. What could we, as part of the SWISLR RCN, add to this mix of social science literature about SWISLR? So we wanted to get a better understanding of some success stories. We wanted to kind of know what has been occurring so we don't recreate anything or step on any kind of toes that are already there. And we also wanted to know who has been surveyed, who is already talked to a lot, or with that analysis, see who's not being talked to. So I've been working with a group of Duke students during this past semester to do this literature review of social science SWISLR papers, and I will present on some of their findings and kind of general literature numbers in just a moment. And then the second part is the other project being worked on by Torry Bend, who will be joining us a little bit later to talk about this project, and she'll have a much better full idea and full kind of storytelling about this project itself. But I have a quote that I wrote down from my SWISLR notebook during the meeting. I don't know exactly who said it, but it was in quotation marks in my journal, so I know someone said it. But I wanted to share it as a way that I think makes this project kind of important and what it should be going forward. And so the quote is, we keep trying to go back in time, but the climate is pushing us into the unknown future, and we need to start imagining alternatives. And I think that this project will do just that. It will allow a space for coastal residents to start imagining a potential future for their community. And as I said before, that question at the beginning is kind of a little warm up to start imagining alternatives, start imagining a future. And I apologize for not getting the person who said it. It was just scribbled in my notebook. So if you did say this, I would love to attribute you, so let me know. So on to the first part of the SWISLR Social Science Literature Review. As I've said before, we talk about the future, we want to make sure we have a grounding of where we've been. So we looked into literature about saltwater intrusion and sea level rise, and we see a lot of research being published about flooding, about precipitation, about climate change, and about sea level rise itself, but very few included saltwater intrusion. I don't have that graph showing right now. This is all of the papers that we were able to collect that were in some form related to saltwater intrusion and sea level rise. And even in this literature itself, very few papers talked about saltwater intrusion and sea level rise in tandem. So it was either saltwater intrusion or sea level rise. And so we want to kind of look at the social science papers and see kind of what they specifically are talking about. But of the papers that contain saltwater intrusion and sea level rise in some form, hardly any were connected to social science. Most were in the environmental science discipline, as you can see from this pie chart. And so that Basque Connections team I mentioned and I are currently diving deeper into this social science literature to really get an idea of what is being talked about within social science SWISLR papers and trying to document how current social science researcher is engaging with community members as well. And one of the first questions that I wanted to highlight that we have some answers on already is the idea of, are people talking about SWISLR? And so we have this question of the natural phenomenon that was talked about within all of the saltwater intrusion and sea level rise social science papers. And what we're originally finding right now is stuff that I've kind of been thinking anyway, but it's interesting to see put into a graph that a lot of SWISLR papers within the social science sphere is talking about flooding and the issues around flooding. And so it drops it drops a bunch when we're talking about saltwater intrusion itself. And I know that this was specifically selected for papers to talk about SWISLR, but even within these specifically selected papers, most of them were talking about flooding, which I find interesting, and I'm intrigued to dive further into this. And I also wanted to highlight the fact that each of my students have created these really awesome projects and research questions through the literature itself, which is one of the reasons why this literature review has sectioned off into its own full-fledged kind of research project, because when we're diving into these social science research papers, there's a lot of really interesting questions coming up and coming out about it. And I won't go into detail of all of their interesting questions because I'm hoping that they'll be able to present their own sometime down the line. But in general, I want to highlight that we're looking into who is studying saltwater intrusion and sea level rise, where are SWISLR studies taking place, how is SWISLR impacting these populations of these areas? And I have one student who's specifically interested in how women are disproportionately impacted. And then what are the means of response to SWISLR impacts? And again, I have one student who's specifically interested in migration. And I will say with that aspect of migration that these papers are global. They're not just the United States, which comes to kind of two of the main things we've found so far is that the current literature is primarily located in 3 locations. I want to share that the location of these literatures are primarily the US and East Coast. We don't have numbers quite yet, but this is the trends that we're seeing. The other place is the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. And then the last place we're seeing a lot of research coming out is river basins throughout Bangladesh. And throughout these places, the literature covers perspectives from a wide range of individuals, from people, victims of natural phenomenon, to farmers who are being impacted by SWISLR. And these perspectives also include local officials who are often then responsible for responding to SWISLR impacts, which I think will have a really interesting outcome when we're talking about mitigation, because we're getting the response from people who are affected, and then also the response from people who are actually doing the mitigation strategies. We then we're starting to look through these perspectives of mitigation strategies, and there are a lot from many different spheres, and it really depends on the adaptation that was brought up based on who's talking about the adaptation and then where the adaptation is taking place. But one thing I wanted to highlight was throughout these papers, there was this common plea to increase community participation and collaboration when making climate decisions. So I think that's going to be another avenue that we're going to look deeper into about who are making these pleas and kind of where are these pleas happening, and are they occurring once the research paper is making this plea for community participation? Are we then seeing that in the location itself? So to finish off my spiel about the literature review, I will just highlight the kind of future scoping of what we're going to be looking at in the future. We have another semester of this Basque Connections research, and the past semester was all about extracting all of this data, and this semester is going to be about looking into the data and kind of seeing what the SWISLR research is telling us. And we're not only going to look at kind of those original questions of who's being engaged with SWISLR research, but we're also going to try digging into how are coastal communities talking about SWISLR impacts and research. And specifically, we're going to look at the questions that are being asked in surveys and interviews throughout these papers, and then what questions are not being asked. And I have this little call out because we are going to kind of survey the surveyors and start asking questions to the social science researchers and hopefully eventually community members to ask them, what should we be asking, or what did you want to ask but weren't able to? And so with that, I am going to come back to this question of, if you were to present the version of the future in the most idyllic terms, what does that look like? And allow you all to put some more responses in this and some time to ask me questions as well. Thank you all for listening.
Kiera, would you mind giving just a little bit of sense of magnitude, like how many papers have you actually found? What's the sort of number for the 3 places that have a lot of published papers?
Yeah, so the number of papers in those 3 different locations, I don't have the numbers for those yet. Those are kind of the general themes, the general locations that we were pulling out while doing extraction. But the number of SWISLR social science research papers we have is 105 that we've been extracting. Oh, Justin, yeah.
I'm curious, Kiera, if you could, social sciences covers a really broad array of disciplinary lenses. Have you broken things down by, are these people looking more at economics, sociology, political science, how they've been breaking down that way?
Yeah, so we, when we pulled all of the papers from Scopus, we took what Scopus decided the discipline was, and that's how we were selecting for social science. And we included social science, there's like economy and management, decision science, and arts and humanity. And so we lumped those all together. And so we have the disciplines that Scopus says. And I think that might give us a little bit of the answer to your question, but I don't yet have the answer to your question. So that's definitely something that we will be looking into.
So the Stories for Change, Envisioning Coastal Futures Through Puppetry section, at the all hands meeting, our group really had a vision for the Stories for Change being a sort of beautiful massive project that brought together communities, the science, social scientists, artists, to discuss the future and to give coastal communities the opportunity to really own their own futures and imagine their own futures, whether that be idealistically, pessimistically, but partially, in part, it was also materially, giving them a chance to sort of build and make through puppetry, whether that be perform, write, actually build puppets themselves, but using that as a way to process the change that they're experiencing, and to process some of that grief that comes with that change. What I found in this time is that as we've idealized the sort of purposes that we had with that, and came up with this beautiful project that sort of addressed these the many purposes that we felt as a group, going back to some of those questions that Kiera posed earlier, who is already doing this adjacent work, and what do people want to talk about, that those questions, as we tried to answer those questions, our beautiful project became just sort of fractured, depending on people's needs, depending on what people were already doing, and depending on what people wanted to talk about. And with that also was when people wanted to talk or could talk, which has been a huge factor for me. So my sort of update is really about how the puppetry component of this is reshaped, given our attempts to answer those questions, and instead of this cohesive project, we have these smaller projects that have started to form that are addressing what people are doing and what people are wanting to talk about and work with. And so in some ways, I think the work we've been doing has been really exciting because it has been receptive to these bigger questions as we've answered these questions about what people are doing. And it's also maybe made us a little more nimble as we address these smaller things. But I'm going to share with you the 4 areas the project has taken and give you some updates on those. Some of which I should say are amazing projects in and of themselves. They just look quite different than maybe what we had originally imagined at the all hands meeting. So the first K through 12 resiliency fables, Liz DiMattia is the director of community science initiative at the Duke Marine Lab, and she has been working with the K through 12 students writing resiliency fables for a few years now. And what they have been finding is that there has been this drive as these fables have become very successful and exciting for the students. There's been a drive to develop these fables into something that's shared more greatly with the community. And as we started talking, puppetry just became a really ideal way to do that. And so we're working actually in the next couple of weeks to develop a program that takes these fables and furthers them into a public storytelling space where the fables will be put on their feet, built into puppet shows, and then shared with a community to sort of give the community a time to talk about the work created by the students, fostered by the students, brought forward by the students, which we're interested to see how that might spur larger conversation within the community around resiliency. And as you may know, Lisa Campbell is a social scientist that has been working with Liz DiMattia, and she's working on sort of the bigger social science picture of whether work happening in the classroom, learning happening in the classroom transitions to the parents at home and the greater community. So we see this sort of public sharing of these stories as an opportunity to sort of give Liz more work, although we're not sure she's going to sign up, but we are looking for social scientists to jump on this project if anybody is excited about how taking this classroom work and bringing it outward might result in some changing of communication within a community. So that's the first sort of splinter. The second is that as I've had conversations with different groups, it's been interesting to hear where interest sparks when I talk about this project. It really varies significantly. If I have a conversation with one person, they get really excited about teaching young people about SWISLR through puppetry. Or if you're talking to someone else, it's, bringing a child's fable to life on stage and connecting a greater community. Or another idea that's kind of come up that people have been excited about is taking the skill set of, say, folks down east who have a carving tradition and bringing them into the storytelling of SWISLR stories by asking them to carve the puppets themselves. So engaging in the actual making of things. What's become really clear about this is that those 3 examples are really different skill sets. You've got, the expert puppet maker who can communicate what's needed to build a puppet, the educator who can develop, performance curriculum that helps work with students in presenting their work in public. And you've got, the artist or director or puppeteer that actually works with performing. As I've had these conversations with people and different people have expressed different parts of this larger project, it's become very clear to me that I am not the ultimate puppeteer that can do all of those things. And so one of the things I've been doing is really talking to particularly puppeteers in North Carolina and South Carolina. But there's been a lot of coastal in the puppetry community, actually, as I've talked about this work, there's been a lot of coastal interest. So I'm creating a sort of loose collective of individuals, puppeteers, who are interested in this kind of work. So as opportunities come up, as we look at grants to potentially write, I can kind of do the matchmaking of what's needed for a grant and an artist given the area, their expertise and things like that. So this sort of side project of a puppetry climate change collective has taken has started to take shape. The third thing that I've been working on is a puppet documentary on farming in Princeville. And this I've uploaded a sort of exploratory storyboard of this project. This is really one of the places where that time and availability has become really clear. You know, as we talked about envisioning coastal futures through puppetry, we sort of were like, well, let's do a quick proof of concept. I'll just talk to someone, record some audio, make a puppet show, and we'll have at least a video puppet documentary that really shows what we're talking about. Well, of course, it's never that easy. And so I've been working with Justin Cook, who has a relationship with folks in Princeville, in particularly Marquetta Dickens, who runs Freedom.org. And they've done a lot of work together, and both of them are incredibly excited about this project. So the enthusiasm is there. And the time that Marquetta has, given farming, given storms, given all of the things that are in her life, of course, we haven't actually had the time to move forward with this quick proof of concept. But what has been really exciting about it is to see the response when I, met with Marquetta and got to hear about the work that they're doing, developing ways to farm in floodplains, shifting from extractive practices of farming to regenerative practices of farming, just to hear her voice talk about the experience of living in Princeville and the work that Freedom.org is starting to do. I then responded with making these storyboards, sent them off to her, and it was that immediate spark of, oh yes, I see how and why this can be poetic, useful, expansive, a lovely, persuasive way to think about how to present some of these ideas. So the project, again, just emails flying around 2 days ago that sort of reignited this. We're excited about starting up again in February. But I'm really getting used to, within the larger project, reminding myself that our timeline, it can't be that of grants necessarily. It sort of has to be of the community that we're working with and the needs of the people that we're in collaboration with as we tell their stories. And so in many ways, it allows me to kind of sit back and let things flow a little bit. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to share is, as I was sitting back trying to just let things happen, not worry about timetables, I found myself anxious to actually make some things. And so this last storyboard, although a pretty rough sketch, is a short puppet show, live puppet show that I've been developing myself. And the hope is that it's a solo puppet show that can be taken on the road very easily, again, spark interest in communities, and about how one might be able to use this form to think about stories, share stories, think about intergenerational storytelling, and connect a sort of artistic poetic piece with literature at an event like a community fair, so that you come and see something that's beautiful and interesting to look at, and you walk away with information of who you can talk to in the area about SWISLR and what's happening in your community. So I guess I rushed through that faster than I thought I would, but those are the sort of ways in which this project has been developing, and we've been learning about how to move forward with these ideas in a productive and useful way. Yeah.
Hey, Torry, could you just we just got the synchronization between what the show you were talking about and your storyboard. Could you walk us through your two storyboards? I think that'd be so cool.
Sure.
Yeah, if I can just jump in real quick. Sorry, I didn't realize the switch happened already, but it was very quickly on both. So would you mind just talking through both of them, starting with the
absolutely
puppetry documentary of farming? Yeah,
sure.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
Of course. And let me, again, I've got to figure out how to expand it. It's tiny, tiny, tiny in my screen. All right, there we go. Yeah, so So the story with Marquetta is I was able to talk with her for not very long. It was, an hour-long conversation, sort of in an informal introduction by Justin Cook. And as she spoke, I was just overcome with the spirit with which she was speaking about the land and farming in particular. Although I should say this is one set of storyboards for 3 separate scenes that we've got. This is the farming section, and then we have a section about what it means to be farming in floodland, and then also a section of developing a town in a thoughtful way as they think about rising water. So this storyboard itself is really looking at that shift from moving from extractive farming, echoes of slavery. So you'll see in the first page, the scene itself will be a field that's also a projection surface. So there's video projection overlaid of cotton farming, and the idea is that the original green of the space is saturated over time through farming and farming and farming and farming and farming in this way. And then we cut to this field that the sun, I think, will probably be a light coming up behind. So we get this glowing red lights. A puppet walks on stage. We see seeds thrown down. As the seeds are sown, the video projection brings more and more color into the scene itself. One of the puppets that has been seeding the soil lifts up the soil itself, brings the other puppet underneath to sleep, rest as the soil is being further seeded. The other puppet gets an opportunity to rest. And then the seeding in the end finally grows actually homes out of it. Part of what Marquetta talked about and the audio that I imagine happening over this is how connected she feels and her community feels to the soil, and that in repairing the health of the soil for regenerative farming, that is actually a really essential part of healing the wounds of the extractive farming and slavery in this place as well. And so as she talks about how all of that is connected, the idea of this sort of playing out with her voice of the work that they're doing is intended to sort of support that spiritual experience that she's having as she thinks about farming in this particular place at Princeville. So that's one scene of that documentary. And then the second set, this, I feel like I was even drawing I was drawing this at the all hands meeting already. This thing that struck me as in the all hands meeting was simply the migration relationship to land, people's relationship to land. And I started thinking about migration and how managed migration might be more palatable, which feels impossible. But one of the things, at least from a sort of puppetry standpoint, is, well, what if migration isn't about people, it's about a bird? And so the idea of, and I also just love the sort of animalistic quality of houses on stilts, and the idea of those stilts just finally giving up and walking, the house finally giving up and walking away. And so my intention with this show is really to stay away from suggesting any human migration and looking more at giving life to a house in relationship to birds, and finding ways to subtly suggest migration as a part of it. And I should say, for this piece, I have no idea what the text of this would be. I've played with whether it needs to be the audio that you're hearing is about how shorebirds are being affected by saltwater and SWISLR. and what's happening there. I've kind of wondered if it needs to be without text at all. But the sort of simple idea is to watch a home in a forest, watch that forest become a ghost forest, watch that water encroach, watch that house go higher and higher and higher on stilts until it just decides to walk away. On the third row, you'll see a note about a cranky, which is a puppet term, a very simple moving backdrop. So the idea to just suggest moving inland. And then again, to sort of torture that bird metaphor, moving into grasslands and the house itself creating a nest that feels protected inland and a little safer. And then to really knock it home, the puppeteer themselves reveals themselves, packs up and walks off stage. It's sort of a trope in puppetry to be the traveling puppeteer, which I think has been overused. But there was, in this case, I was like, well, this is a really meaningful way to use it, to actually watch a stage walk itself away to another location, could be strong. So I'm currently working with some folks we're figuring out the stage first to see if that works, but we're currently working on a puppet stage that can be carried on a back, and in an ideal world has sort of horse-like legs, that can walk off stage. And we'll figure out some of and we have figured out how to get a tree to sort of shed and turn into a ghost forest. So lots of prototyping happening, and excited about where this could go.
Thank you so much for sharing, Torry. It's exciting to see all of the different projects that you're creating and coming up with. And I'd love to kind of open the floor to everyone here on Zoom if they have any questions or comments for Torry before Torry and I have questions for you all.
I just want to say this is really cool, Torry. I particularly love the last where you're going with that. It's so cool. And I'm wondering if there's some way we might get your inspiration to think about getting a bunch of eggheads at our next SWISLR meeting to try to put on a puppet show. Like I just love the idea of like, what would we do, right?
Yeah.
I love that you were sort of the wild card at our SWISLR meeting and how much that introduces a little bit of fun and whimsy and art and creativity into the space, which we so badly need, because otherwise it helps it be less depressing. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I can even throw something out right now. Finding one beautiful image that you feel like holds the potential for something, as we go back to the question that Kiera and I asked, like, what is the potential? Even use AI generated to come up with what the vision, those images that are without text can offer a lot of expansiveness for some of these things too. So there's a lot of room if you're looking for something to keep your spirits up, trying to just find a beautiful image that offers that creative possibility of the future can be really great. And I'll continue to think of exercises to get you all on your feet doing puppet shows.
And Torry, would you want to talk at all about kind of where this question came from? We have a bunch of responses already, but I just wanted to know if you wanted to add anything before we jump into our questions for the group.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me that the question is just, I think, a creative way of softening some of the anxiety. That if you're freed to think about the most idealistic possible future, then maybe you're not stretched or stressed by the immediacy of all of the issues that surround trying to make that happen. And that in itself as an uplifting possibility and a motivation to keep working and a motivation to keep thinking becomes interesting. And for me, as I think about walking into communities that are, dealing with this day in and day out in the realness of the threat to their home, anything that offers space for them to say, this is what I really want, this is what I'm really hoping for. And then to just think of that when you say that, you immediately start thinking about all the reasons why it can't necessarily work, but I think it can be just a way to take a breath and keep moving forward. A rambly answer, Kiera, but
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great addition to the question. And with the last kind of 5 or 6 minutes of our time here, I want to kind of quickly, we're not going to break out into breakout groups or anything, but I want to quickly pull these kind of questions up that would really help Torry and I talking about or planning out kind of how we're going to create these spaces. And so the questions we have, I'll read out real quick and then I'll stop sharing and put them in the chat so we can kind of see all of our faces instead. So first, we really want to know what public spaces you've been able to have conversations about climate change and SWISLR safely and kind of be able to share your opinions. And I'll be able to share a Google Doc or something so you can anonymize your response if you want as well, and if you don't want to just say it out loud. But then secondly, what do you think the factors that allowed these kind of safe conversations to happen? And then finally, what space would you feel safe as adults expressing these idealized futures that we've forced you all to think about in the Slido responses? So I will stop sharing the screen. And hello, everybody. And put those questions in the chat. And then the last thing I will do is share a Google Doc. So if you have ideas but don't want to unmute and share them, you can put them into Google Doc instead.
Well, I mean, one thing I'll say that I think probably we all share is that most of us are working in places where we're regularly interacting with students and colleagues who are from coastal counties and communities, right? So we have this opportunity to engage with people that we're encountering. I'm thinking about in the climate course we taught last fall that Torry was a part of and Kiera was a part of. A number of students, for their last project where they wanted to share what they want to talk about climate change. We're talking about their own experience of living on coastlines, dealing with hurricanes, dealing with incredibly hot water. I mean, creating an opportunity for hearing their stories seems seems like very low-hanging fruit that we could capitalize on and would be valuable.
I think one of our questions too, Emily, is that as we walk into these communities and connect with people, we've been surprised at how often the student stories are really great, and how often it's suddenly like, wait, this is a very different feeling than it is in the classroom too. And so I think your point is so right that there's low-hanging fruit areas to collect stories, and gravitating towards those is really important. And then also kind of figuring out when we're walking to other spaces, like what we can do or how to shift to get that comfort in ways of reaching people who might be a little uncomfortable in other spaces.
And I think one of the big things that one of these questions, especially of what space do you feel safe as adults expressing kind of these vulnerable ideas, is because if we do want to go into these communities and suggest puppet shows, we want to make sure that we're allowing them the freedom to interact with it as they wish and allow them the kind of space that they see, that they feel comfortable in, so that we can get a kind of a true reaction. And I think that's a big question that we had of what spaces can we utilize to allow for kind of freedom of ideas and thoughts. And I think feedback from the RCN could be super helpful.
So, sorry, can I just comment real quick? I love those storyboards. Those look really cool, Torry. And I love the second one about the house and the birds. And I'm sorry if this is like my scientist hat, right? But like there is some research showing, right, that like with bird species, some gain, some lose, right? So these transitions are not always bad for birds. And so I don't know if there's any way to think about that or incorporate that, or it's getting too much into the weeds. But Paul Tally did research on that, and that was one of his always comments is like, right, it's not all loss, right? And maybe there's a new house that comes into where the other one formed and the nest is formed. I don't know, but again, I do think that's one of those resilient stories that we can tell, that it's not always just about loss, but about change, right?
That is music to my ears. I mean, I think part of what you've just confirmed what my hope was, is that it wouldn't be about people, but it would be more about just, it's not about loss all the time. It's about the complex nature of the shift. Um, and and by removing the human component, can we allow space for people to think more openly about change versus their grief in particular. And so I thank you. That's fantastic. I will also say I have an anxiety that anytime I do a show, people are gonna be like, yes, but that is the wrong kind of bird and the wrong kind of nest and the wrong kind of place. So I'm gonna have to make sure I get some people to double check my work.
I personally, a lot of people didn't go on the field trip with us after the SWISLR meeting, but the Karen Emspacher, her Heritage Museum has this whole section on wood duck decoys, and it's a waterfowl carving hotspot. And I love the idea of engaging with that craftsmanship. To me, that feels like a place that could be pretty exciting. But kids are making stories and adults are helping create puppet. I mean, that feels like it hits so many notes that could be really interesting.
Yeah, and when you look, I mean, that actually was the place that really was the first place I was like, oh, this could be really great. And when you start looking at other parts of the country too, it got me thinking about, well, if you've got a community that has a history of quilting or has a history of painting, having a community do painted backdrops for a set, there's so many opportunities to expand into the community and get engagement on a story that might be specifically SWISLR related, and they might be complete climate deniers, but excited about carving birds and excited about carving puppets. And suddenly they go and realize, they're working on this show that's actually a fable about climate change. So the potential feels really rich to me. And a lot of the questions that Kiera and I are asking too is like how to convince people to let us in and actually and kind of do some of this work too. And I think, as everyone's talked about, oversaturated places and finding folks who can talk, want to talk, have space in their lives to talk or carve, whatever it happens to be.
I'm seeing now that we have kind of 2 minutes about left of the time, and I think kind of Torry's last little speech about places and availability is a great way to end our talk about interacting with communities and engaging in a meaningful way. And so if you have any last kind of thoughts or questions, of course, you can always email Torry or I with your kind of comments. And then this Google Doc will stay open if you have any ideas that you just want to throw in there for us to tell us what to do. But I will kind of close out just by saying thank you all for joining our first SWISLR webinar of 2024. And that the next SWISLR webinar is February 9th at 12 East ET. And it will be Ashley Helton will be talking about the projects that came out of Theme 3, that how are water management and climate change interacting under SWISLR. So Ashley and her team are in a process of creating 2 commentaries on hydrology and water management in the coastal plain, and she'll be able to share and talk more about those February 9th. And then again, just a reminder, the SALT conference and the SWISLR RCN all hands meeting will be June 11th to 14th. And I will hopefully have more information to share about that conference and about that meeting shortly. But thank you all for joining, and see you all next month.